Welcome back. France is clearly not happy with comments President Trump made about their French President Emmanuel Macron on Tuesday, which happened to be the third anniversary of the Paris terrorist attacks. Trump criticized Macron's call for a European army and his recent condemnation of nationalism, saying in part, quote, "The problem is that Emmanuel suffers from a very low approval rating in France, 26%, and an unemployment rate of almost 10%. He was just trying to get onto another subject. By the way, there is no country more nationalist than France. Very proud people, and rightfully so, make France great again." Earlier today, a French government spokesman offered this response to our president, quote, "Yesterday was November 13. We were commemorating the murder of 130 of our people, so I'll reply in English. Common decency would have been appropriate." This all follows Trump's lonely weekend in Paris, during which he reportedly was in a very angry mood and half the time looked it. The trip prompted Washington Post opinion columnist David Ignatius to write in part, quote, "Trump set the NATO alliance wobbling from the day he took office, raising doubts about the United States' continued readiness to pay for other countries' defense. Europeans spent a year trying to make nice, but they seem to have gotten the message. The United States isn't a fully reliable protector anymore." Well, here to talk about all of it, America's changing role in the world stage, a veteran diplomat, Michael McFaul, our former U.S. ambassador to Russia. Ambassador, I started with a foreign correspondent earlier this week by asking the standard question, what are they saying about us over there? And to your mind, what are they saying about us over there?
You know, I think David gets it right. In the beginning, they were trying to make good, to think that they could court him, and everybody thought flattery works with the president. But 2 years in, they're not finding that that works. And so they're thinking about going their own ways. And let's be clear, they've been talking about a European army long before President Trump. So that's not something new. But to say it the way they did when he was there was striking to me. The other thing that was striking to me, I traveled with President Obama to many of these kind of summits over the course of my time when I worked at the White House. There was always a giant demand to get on his schedule, right? We used to have to duke it out. Who was he going to meet with? It was striking to me that nobody seemed to want to meet with President Trump. He was just sitting there, as you said, alone. He had one major bilat that was with President Macron.
If we are a nation alone increasingly because he is increasingly a president alone, if that follows, who wins? Who benefits from that?
Well, first, I think it's very dangerous that we're alone. I want to make that clear. The withdrawal doctrine of the Trump administration, pulling out of the INF treaty, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, pulling out of the TPP, the trade deal in Asia, that makes us weaker. And what drives me nuts about the president is he somehow thinks by pulling out makes us stronger. That's not the history of the last 7 decades. By being engaged, by being a leader, that makes us stronger. But what happens in the vacuum, I think in the short run, it's great for Putin. Putin loves this in Europe. The NATO allies tweeting at each other and arguing with each other, that's good for him in the short run. And in the long run, I think the big winner is China.
And when you look at this president on that stage, his reluctance to mark World War I, the first day of his visit.
Why go there if you're not going to show up?
Apparently because of precipitation. The next day he made this appearance. But the kind of duty and honor of the American presidency that he is not going along with.
Yeah, I would say two things about that. One, his job is to advance American national interests when he engaged with other countries. And when I see trips like this, I look at the score sheet and I say, what American interest was advanced? And when I look at other ones, Helsinki Summit, I go back to other ones, it just doesn't seem like he puts that at the top. The other thing, he's representing the United States of America. He's not there as Donald Trump. And I, as an American, I want him to show up. I want him to show the honor to those veterans killed in action. What could be more important for us? That is his job. It's not just for him to travel and do what he wants. He's representing our country, the United States of America.
Finally, please lay bare all of your electronic communications with your former colleagues. I'm kidding, but what are your friends in the diplomatic service saying? The people who make the work go and make our embassies go and actually carry out U.S. policy on the ground.
Of course they don't like it. They need a leader that shows up and then advance their interests, right? When I was the head of the Moscow embassy, we had something called deliverables. So when a senior person comes, especially the president, you want to get tangible things done. Again, it's not apparent that we got anything done from this trip to France. You know, some complain that he's not at the Asia summits right now, right? He didn't go to the ASEAN summit. Obama used to show up for that all the time. He's not going to the APEC summit. President Xi's going to be there, right? Winners and losers. He's showing up because he knows it's important. But a part of me thinks, well, maybe it's just better if he doesn't show up because he doesn't really want to participate in that. Maybe the vice president will do a better job.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.